The important thing at the moment is that both Labour and the opposition, the Conservatives in particular, have come up with some new ideas in terms of performance management that may be quite significant. The first one from Labour is the idea of entitlements. The idea here is that there's a set of minimum standards you can expect from certain services. For example, you mustn't wait more than 6 weeks in the NHS, and that those are enforceable not through a performance management regime per se, where there are sanctions from the state for not conforming with government regulations, but actually that individuals have a right to take legal action for redress if standards aren't achieved. This is quite interesting because it's a way of locking in minimum standards without having some of the regulation. However, it certainly doesn't compensate for some of the failings of the target regime that we've seen over the past period. In particular, it will increase the focus on a very narrow set of measures. So what that measure is becomes even more important than it was. You can see these being real P45 indicators in a sense, so that managers will be forced to focus on those possibly to the detriment of service in other areas, and I think there'll be potential perverse consequences around some of them unless they're implemented very carefully. They also don't solve certain problems. For example, the fact that we're quite good at getting standards up from bad to medium, but we're not good at getting excellence. And what entitlements can't do, if they're going to be enforceable or legally enforceable, is get us from good to excellent. What it will do is help preserve a base level of standards. So that's the Labour account, which is very interesting. The second account is coming from the Conservatives at the moment. And they're very focused on making sure that government departments and organisations are held accountable for their individual performance through measures approaching performance contracts in a way. But they're also very focused on the cost question. They're very keen to get some firm economy targets in, to get more information into the system so that people can compare performance of different organisations, even international comparisons, which is actually a very favourable direction to move in. The challenge there is they're focused on the performance of organisations. And the risk is that actually by focusing on the organisations, for example, the NHS, you can miss the point of the outcomes, for example, quality adjusted life years. And you can miss, by focusing on organisations, there is a risk that you increase the accountability of the organisation, but might not necessarily improve the performance of the public sector overall. So I think there are two interesting directions there that are already really in the air. And there are a number of further directions that I think both parties, major parties, are talking about. And they are to do with using more markets and choice to drive performance improvement and to increase local accountability for services as well. And I think those are interesting directions that haven't really been thought through as concretely as these ideas around departmental contracts or entitlements.
Mm-hmm. But so do you think that whichever party is going to rule the country after 2010, there's going to be a real change? Or do you think that we are still playing around with rhetoric? Because after all, yes, entitlements, well, yes, they might be different from target, but perhaps not so radically. We can talk about market, we can talk about accountability and choice, but that's also something that is relatively old. Are we not just trying to revamp something that perhaps has not really worked in the past?
I think it's a good challenge. The real risk is that baby is thrown out with the bathwater. So because there's a strong political rhetoric against targets, performance management, bureaucracy, which in many cases is valid, and we've seen examples of gaming in health, for example, that would suggest that there are problems with targets when done badly. The real problem is that you might throw out all the information you've got in the system by not measuring it anymore, and then you're not able to compare performance across different organisations. So that's one risk. The other risk is you throw out some very sensible mechanisms that have emerged over the last few years for improving the coordination of the activities of different organisations in the public sector. One example would be in Whitehall now, in central government, there are public service agreement boards, which are basically topic-focused boards that with representatives from different departments. So, for example, there would be a group looking at childhood obesity, say, and on that board there would be individuals from the Department for Health, Department for Education, and they're having a dialogue, a sensible dialogue about what the right policy direction is to reduce childhood obesity, say. Now that's a sensible innovation, but if you shift to a departmental focus for your performance regime, the risk is that that disappears, and that seems a shame.
Absolutely. So, in a nutshell, what we can see is perhaps there are two different directions. maybe not as radical as they seem when they're going to be put in practice, if one of them is going to be put in practice. But we are expecting some changes. So it's not just, just the cover of the thing, but it's the real thing that is going to change.
I think there will certainly be changes. The question is whether these smaller changes, which you identify, will be achieved on top of the existing architecture or will replace it. And the question is whether some of these more radical ideas will actually form into anything real.